Before moving into Lesson 5, let's review who is responsible for collecting, gathering, and analyzing data. This was briefly introduced in Lesson 1, where it was indicated that all administrators and faculty in a program should participate in the assessment process. However, it is usually best if only one person coordinates the assessment process. Remember, you will need to designate an assessment coordinator for your program in your final assessment plan. For now, we will assume that you are the assessment coordinator. You have developed program-level student learning outcomes and identified methods to assess them, but now what do? As indicated in Lesson 1, when assessing student learning outcomes, it is necessary to gather evidence. Some accreditation agencies may even define what they mean by evidence. For example, the Southern Association Commission on Colleges and Schools Handbook for Reaffirmation or Accreditation indicates, evidence is a coherent and focused body of information supporting a judgment of compliance, and must be reliable, current, verifiable, coherent, objective, relevant, and representative. Your evidence will be the data that you have set out to collect. As was stated in Lesson 4, assessment can be thought of as a four-step process. First, you provide opportunities for student learning that align to the program's student learning outcomes. Second, you gather the data related to that student learning. Third, you evaluate and interpret the data. And finally, you use those results to plan improvements. Perhaps you are asking yourself what types of data should be collected. Qualitative data is data that are rich in detail and description, usually in a textual or narrative format. Examples would include data from case studies, focus groups, or document review. Quantitative data consists of numeric information, including quantities, percentages, and statistics. You might want to pull both qualitative and quantitative data from assignments such as papers, capstones, performance, scores on national standardized exams, and team projects. You may also want to think about the indirect evidence that your program gathers that might also provide you with information about student learning. At this point, determine what other data you might need to supplement your learning evidence. Grades, GPAs, and matriculation rates may all be useful information that you'll need for assessment. You may want to examine any program-wide surveys that might align to the student learning outcomes. More often than not, your program has multiple built-in assessment points. It's pretty rare that a program needs to add an assessment point to their process. It is conceivable that you could discover that something is missing. Don't rule out the idea of adding a specific assessment point, but more often than not, you won't need to. Now that you've determined which evidence you need to gather, you must create your assessment cycle. Begin with the requirements of your institution or accrediting body. Some may require that every outcome be assessed every year. Some may require a less frequent assessment. Generally, a good rule of thumb is to assess all learning outcomes within a time frame that allows for all students to benefit from the improvements to the program. At the University of Kentucky, we ask that programs establish a 3-year assessment cycle. All outcomes must be assessed at least once every 3 years. Using that cycle, the assessment for our example program might look something like this. Establishing a timeline for each outcomes assessment will help to ensure that programs assess every outcome at a regular interval. It also allows for time to gather the appropriate evidence. Finally, it helps to keep assessment at the forefront of the faculty's thoughts. Assessment should never be an afterthought. It should drive the curriculum and improvements of the program. Consider being familiar with other terminology when looking at your data. Look in the Resources folder for definitions of data set, raw data, categorize, mean, standard deviation, and benchmark. Once you have your data, you might think, how do I analyze this to make it useful for faculty reflection? After reviewing your data, consider any questions you may have about what was measured. If you do not have any specific questions in mind, start here. Who are our students, and what are our students learning? And finally, how effective is our program, unit, or department? Other questions you might consider? How does the data shape planning for your program? How does the data shape budgeting for your program? And how do you plan on implementing the change needed? When looking at the data as a whole, what story does the data seem to be telling you? Look for any gaps or themes you may see. Consider how you will share the data and analysis, collaboratively identify improvements that need to be made based on the data provided, and finally, be sure to come back and reflect on the changes made or not made. When you consider all data, you are more likely to head down a path of improvement based on good information.